Welcome to Takeshi's Bench, where you can discuss all things philosophical. So this is the second episode on Japanese philosophy, immediately following the previous one. So I talked about how Sourcebook is the book to have if you want to study the history of Japanese philosophy. But then at the end of the first episode, I briefly talked about the structural problems that we would face if we use the Sourcebook, and structural problem that the Sourcebook itself has. But then I like to talk about this sort of problem of reception, the structural problems that we face as we receive this book in the context of academia. So what is the structural problem? I briefly mentioned this, but I would like to talk about this book, Taking Back Philosophy, a Multicultural Manifesto, written by Bryan Van Norden. It's a very famous book, came out in 2017 from Columbia University Press. It's forwarded by J. Garfield, who is also famous for working in the field of Buddhist philosophy. Now, Taking Back Philosophy basically tries to argue that the Western academia houses philosophical institutions that only study Western philosophy, so they should name their philosophy department Western Philosophy Department rather than Philosophy Department, because philosophy belongs to multiple intellectual traditions, like the Sourcebook was arguing. Right? If we actually expand the definition of philosophy as polyvocal sphere of intellectual discussions, where we try to understand ourselves and our world in given historical context, then we should be able to actually grant different forms of doing philosophy, not only the European, but also Japanese, Chinese, Indian, Mexican, Polynesian, Latin American, whatever. You can come up with the different culturally distinct philosophical traditions if we expand the notion of philosophy to something more than just European. Now, Van Norden talks about this in the context of American academia, so the language is quite bombastic, and I'm not entirely sure if the European audience will be able to actually appreciate some of the things that he's bringing up to the discussion. But what is really interesting about this book to me is the foreword given by J. Garfield. He mentions this really interesting argument about the structural racism. So basically, he argues that the Anglo-European academia suffers from structural racism. Now, structural racism is different from individual racism. So individual racism is a single individual making a decision to become a racist. But structural racism is something like this. Regardless of the intention of the individual that participating in structure, actually contributing to the overarching movement of racism. So let's say I study European philosophy at the European University. By studying European philosophy within the context of academia, we are actually contributing to the sustenance of Eurocentrism and racism that are inherent in the study of European intellectual tradition, or something like that. Okay, so the structure of academia is set up in such a way that if we are participating in it and get a degree, we tend to go along with the Eurocentrism and other inequality that it endorses. So regardless of the individual intent, the structure is set up in such a way that we tend to encourage the behavior, social behavior of racism. So in the context of academia, philosophy programmed in such a way that it only promotes European intellectual traditions, and it's not interested in studying any other intellectual traditions, or simply philosophical programs tend to be Eurocentric and male-dominant fields such that it doesn't encourage cultural diversity or gender equality, or something like that. I think this argument is very interesting, but we have to be careful about the use of this argument, because sometimes I heard arguments something like, well, if you read Kant, you'll become racist, so you shouldn't read the works of Immanuel Kant. Or I don't like to read the works of Plato because it's written by a white European male, therefore I don't want to actually participate in this structural racism by reading the works of Plato. I think it is very dangerous to literally label the effect of reading certain texts with what you're going to do. So the easiest example is something like this. If you read any text from 1930s Japan, you tend to become imperialist. That is absolutely not the case. If you read Hitler's Mein Kampf, that doesn't actually necessarily make you someone who endorses National Socialism, right? In the same way, yeah, of course, there are elements of racism in the works of Kant, and there are elements of racism or endorsement of slavery in works of Aristotle, but their works are equally useful for justifying the opposite position, and in fact, a comprehensive analysis of their works are foundational for some of the most valuable contributions in contemporary politics or ethics in Europe. For instance, think about the discussions on virtue ethics or the Kantian influence on the theoretical foundation of human rights. So what we do with the text depends on the reader rather than the content of the book. And in many cases, even the content of the book is not endorsing what a lot of people actually claim to be the structural racism. So when you make any kind of the structural argument, right, it doesn't have to be racism. It could be structural anti-feminism or structural anti-Semitism or specific cases. I think it would be very dangerous to use this kind of argument because, if it's written by a white guy, we shouldn't read it. If we use that kind of argument, what are we going to do with this book, Taking Back Philosophy? It is definitely written by two white male, right? But this notion of structural problem is very interesting, and I'd like to actually introduce how this is relevant to the study of Japanese philosophy. So let's do a case study. First, I'd like to pay attention to this famous website called PhilPapers. This is hosted by the largest organization of philosophers, which is called American Philosophical Association, or APA. PhilPapers indexes papers written by philosophers from around the world, and they are archived by philosophy scholars themselves. It houses the largest number of entries, and then we have this section called Japanese philosophy. So let's take a look at this PhilPapers and how it functions with the category of Japanese philosophy. Now, if you go to PhilPapers, welcome to PhilPapers, you immediately see this statement. PhilPapers is a comprehensive index and bibliography of philosophy maintained by the community of philosophers. We monitor all sources of research content in philosophy, including journals, books, open access archives, and personal pages maintained by academics. We also host the largest open access archive in philosophy. Our index currently contains 2.4 million entries categorized in 5,472 categories, and PhilPapers has over 250,000 registered users. So if you actually read this, wow, PhilPapers is actually amazing. And also you wonder, philosophy as a business is actually booming. Like how in the world that every single department seems to be downsizing and having budget problems? But if you read actual PhilPapers, wow, there are so many philosophers in the world and everybody seems to be really vibrant in working these philosophical problems. So if field of philosophy is booming, the field of Japanese philosophy should also be booming, right? But here's the problem. When you go to PhilPapers, you actually have this search box. And let's say you want to search Japanese philosopher from pre-modern Japan, Kukai, right? And then, of course, you have section of Kukai, right? It has a category of Kukai. There's a number of articles published. So 17 found on the term Kukai. But let's say we typed his name in Japanese. This is how you write Kukai in Japanese, and this is the result you get. PhilPaper.org says, you must specify a search query of 3 or more characters. Do you see the structural problem? So if you try to type a Japanese name like a Kukai, or the same, Dogen, another Zen Buddhist from medieval Japan, try to search his name on PhilPapers, and you get the same. You must specify a search query of 3 or more characters. That is to say, any Japanese names that comes in 2 characters cannot be searched on PhilPapers. This is quite problematic. That's the first problem. All right, maybe that's just a small glitch. Okay, then let's type different name. Nishida Kitaro, the founder of Kyoto School of Philosophy. He's also considered to be the father of modern Japanese philosophy. He must be actually searchable in Japanese, right? Because his name is 5 characters. So if you hit his name in 5 characters, what happens? You get this, but request. Your browser sent a request that this server could not understand. So I think this is actually a problem for non-Western philosophers. So if you type words in Japanese or Chinese, as far as I can check, PhilPapers cannot function or recognize it as searchable words. Here's the structural problem for you. In a field of philosophy, 5 canonical languages are German, French, Latin, and Greek, right? And then you speak English as lingua franca. So if you write philosophy papers in English, you have more readership. So it's inevitable that you're going to do things in English, right? Why do you think I'm actually making a YouTube clip in English, right? And then you have continental philosophical language or the history of philosophy language of Greek, Latin, and modern German and French. So you study in 5 languages. And then other European languages are still spelled in alphabet. So let's include that. Even though nobody's actually talking about Spanish and Italian philosophy in the same way as we talk about German and French philosophy, but they are searchable certainly as European languages, right? But then once you include other languages like Japanese or Chinese or Korean, it becomes problematic for search engines. This is the kind of structural problem. If you look into the problem further, it will be more distinct. So let's say Japanese philosophy. So Japanese philosophy has a category under the label of Asian philosophy. That's great. That's better than anyone else, right? And I'm actually editing this section with Curtis Rigsby. And you can see the subcategories of Japanese philosophy is exactly the same as the table of contents in Sourcebook. So I basically took the table of contents from Sourcebook and just dropped into PhilPapers. So you see Japanese Buddhism, Confucianism, Shinto native traditions in 19th century, samurai, 20th century, and different themes or topics in Japanese philosophy. So it's the same. Now it says the category of Japanese philosophy has 4,765 entries. That seems a lot, but actually not at all. If you search Japanese philosophy in Japanese language, this is nowhere near the actual number. To show you how 4,700 entries, how small it is in the field of philosophy, I just give you an example of Aristotle. And then you have ancient Greek and Roman philosopher Aristotle, right? If you go to this category, you'll be able to see you have different categories for Aristotelian philosophy or works of Aristotle. And it says 11,688 entries found on the works of Aristotle. So can you imagine that the entire field of Japanese philosophy is less than half of what's available in the works of Aristotle? And I'm not saying that the works of Aristotle is exhaustively studied or that we should stop studying Aristotle. I think there are still many great discussions taking place in relation to the works of Aristotle. Maybe 11,000 works is not enough to unpack the depth and profound insight that we can get from the Aristotelian philosophy. But it is crazy to think that the entire intellectual history of Japan is less than secondary works on Aristotle. But I have to mention, the works that are written on intellectual history of Japan have to be much more than 11,000 entries. Just because this philosopher's index doesn't include non-Western languages like Japanese, Korean, Chinese, any entries on Japanese philosophy in these languages, and especially Japanese philosophy studying these languages much more in English, are not included in this index. So you can see how we don't really have a proper infrastructure to be able to receive what's being written on Japanese philosophy in Japanese language. So this is a structural problem that I would see in the side of academic reception of non-Western philosophy or specifically Japanese philosophy. But I don't think it's fair to blame on the structure from outside. The fact is that scholars of Japanese philosophy are inside this academia, right? So their responsibility or our responsibility is to make the gap as small as possible. So instead of using the structural argument to say that less people should study Aristotle and Plato or Western philosophy and more people should study non-Western philosophy, I don't think this should be the case. I think the case should be more people should study all philosophy altogether. So instead of decreasing the number of people who are studying European philosophy, which is happening already, but instead of doing that, we should just increase the mass, the sum total of people working in the field of philosophy, and then exponentially increase the number of people in the field of non-Western philosophy, including Japanese philosophy. Also, the responsibility goes to the scholars. Unless the scholars provide the translation of Japanese philosophical texts for the general audience in North America and Europe, we will never actually get to know what Japanese philosophy is in Anglo-European context. So I think it's very important to keep in mind that the structural problem doesn't just blame institutions and the ways in which philosophy curriculum are set up in most European philosophy institutes, but we should actually argue that the Japanese philosophers should translate more text into the Western languages and publishers should help them to make these texts available for the general audience. And then improving some of the technical issues that we have for the indexing. And someday, maybe we will see much less gap between European and non-European philosophy, including Japanese philosophy. On that note, I'd like to finish this talk on the structural problem of Japanese philosophy. But this is something to keep in mind. So when you read the Sourcebook, you try to go into the library and try to find the books that are written by any of these thinkers introduced in the Sourcebook, but then you end up finding nothing about them. The librarian takes you to the section of non-Western philosophy or Asian philosophy sections, and you have 5 books on Japanese philosophy, and then you can't find anything else. It's just the way in which we've been publishing books on philosophy and introducing the intellectual history of European philosophy is such that we are still behind on introducing non-European philosophical texts. So that is what we're trying to actually overcome as a scholars of comparative and Asian philosophy or comparative and Japanese philosophy. And so give us more time to provide you more materials and publications to help you understand the entire framework of intellectual history of Asia in general and then intellectual history of Japan in particular. Okay, if you made it this far, you should definitely like this video. And also, if you're interested in philosophy, please subscribe to this channel, Takeshi's Bench. If you have any questions about philosophy or comments, arguments, and ideas on all things philosophical, please send them to us through comments below. We will try to pick some of them for the future episodes. Thanks for watching and see you next time.